Robert Caldwell smirked at me across the mahogany conference table while his lawyer mistress, Victoria Sterling, slid the final divorce papers toward me with manicured nails that probably cost more than most people's grocery budgets. "Sign here, Margaret," she purred, her voice dripping with the satisfaction of a woman who'd systematically dismantled another woman's life. The papers awarded him everything. Our house, his company, $3 million in assets, even Max and Bella, our golden retrievers who'd slept at the foot of our bed for 8 years. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me back up and tell you how a 63-year-old woman who'd spent 38 years building a life with someone could end up sitting in a law office, watching her entire world get redistributed to the man who'd been cheating on her with his attorney. Because trust me, the irony wasn't lost on me that the woman destroying my marriage was literally a lawyer. It started 6 months ago when I noticed Robert working late more often. Not unusual for the CEO of Caldwell Industries, except these weren't client dinners or board meetings. These were private consultations with Victoria Sterling, Esquire, who specialized in corporate law and apparently stealing husbands. I discovered their affair the way most wives do, by accident. Robert's phone buzzed during dinner with a text that made him smile in a way he hadn't smiled at me in years. The text was from V. Sterling and read, "Can't wait to feel you inside me again. Now, I may be in my 60s, but I wasn't born yesterday." I knew exactly what kind of consultation that was. When I confronted Robert, he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "Margaret, we've grown apart," he said, as if our marriage was a garden he'd simply forgotten to water. "Victoria understands my ambitions. She shares my vision for the company's future." What he meant was, she's young, she's hungry, and she's willing to do things you're not. I got it. Men like Robert always trade up when they hit 65, as if a younger woman could somehow reverse the aging process for them too. But here's what really burned me up. I'd helped build Caldwell Industries from a 3-person construction company into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. While Robert charmed clients and played golf, I managed the books, handled HR, and put in 60-hour weeks without a single stock option or official title. I was the woman behind the curtain, and now the curtain was being pulled away to reveal nothing. At least, nothing with my name on it. Victoria had done her homework thoroughly. Since the company was incorporated under Robert's name before our marriage, I had no legal claim to it. The house, purchased with company funds, would go to him. Our joint accounts? He'd been slowly draining them for months, moving money into offshore accounts that his brilliant attorney had somehow made disappear on paper. "You'll receive spousal support," Victoria said, her tone suggesting she was being generous. $1,500 a month for 2 years. $1,500 a month. To the woman who'd given up her own career to build his empire. I looked at Robert, this man I'd loved since I was 25, and saw a stranger. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his custom suit impeccable, his gold watch catching the afternoon light streaming through the law office windows. He looked successful, powerful, untouchable. "Sue me," he said, with that same smirk when I asked about the missing $3 million from our retirement accounts. "I own this town, Margaret. My lawyers will tie you up in court for years, and you don't have the money to fight me." That's when Victoria leaned forward with her closing argument. Of course, there's also the matter of the dogs. Robert has documented their care expenses through the company. Technically, Max and Bella are corporate assets. Corporate assets. My dogs. The only living things in that house who still loved me unconditionally, and she was calling them corporate assets. I signed the papers because what choice did I have? I was broke, alone, and apparently, according to the state of Connecticut, completely invisible. But as I walked out of that office, my entire life condensed into one small suitcase, I remembered something my grandfather Henry used to say, "Maggie girl, sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you're really made of." I was about to find out exactly what Margaret Caldwell was made of, and Robert was going to be very sorry he'd underestimated me. The moving truck pulled away from what used to be my house at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I know the exact time because I was sitting in my 10-year-old Honda Civic, watching strangers load my entire life into a vehicle that would drive it to a storage unit I could barely afford. Robert stood in the doorway with Victoria, his arm around her waist, both of them watching my humiliation with the satisfied expressions of people who'd executed a perfect heist. The really twisted part? They were moving her into my house that same weekend. I knew this because our neighbor, Helen, had texted me about the moving trucks she'd seen. Apparently, Victoria was bringing her own furniture. My 38 years of carefully chosen antiques, family photos, and garden that I'd spent decades nurturing were being replaced faster than you could say hostile takeover. I'd been staying at the Motel 6 on Route 9 for 3 days. It was the kind of place where the ice machine was permanently broken and the continental breakfast consisted of stale donuts and coffee that could strip paint. The manager, a kind woman named Rosa, had given me the senior discount without my asking. 63 and homeless. Apparently, I looked like I needed all the help I could get. The worst part wasn't losing the house or the money. It was Max and Bella. I'd raised those dogs from puppies. Max was the one who'd lie across my feet when I was sick, and Bella was my garden companion, following me around the yard while I planted roses and pulled weeds. They were my children, the only family Robert and I had ever managed to create together. When I tried to see them yesterday, Victoria answered the door wearing my favorite robe, a silk kimono Robert had brought me from a business trip to Japan 15 years ago. "I'm sorry, Margaret," she'd said with fake sympathy, "but the dogs are quite bonded to their new routine. Robert thinks it would be confusing for them to have visits." I could hear Max barking in the background, that excited bark he always made when he heard my voice. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Bella by the sliding door, tail wagging frantically. They knew I was there. "Please," I'd said, hating myself for begging. "Just for an hour." Victoria's expression hardened. "The divorce agreement is very clear about asset distribution. Perhaps you should have thought about this before you became so difficult during the proceedings." Difficult? Because I dared to ask for half of what I'd helped build. Now, sitting outside the motel, I called my sister Joyce in Florida. We hadn't spoken in 2 years. Some stupid argument about Mom's china that seemed ridiculous now. "Maggie?" Joyce's voice was cautious. "Is everything okay?" "Robert left me," I said simply. "For his lawyer. They took everything." There was a long pause. "Jesus Christ, Maggie. Are you okay?" "Where are you?" "Motel 6. I have about $800 left and nowhere to go." "Pack your bag," Joyce said immediately. "I'm booking you a flight to Tampa. Tonight." "Joyce, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm telling. Mom always said family sticks together when things get bad. Things look pretty bad." 6 hours later, I was on a plane to Florida with everything I owned fitting into one carry-on bag. The man next to me was reading the Wall Street Journal, and I caught a glimpse of an article about successful companies in Connecticut. Caldwell Industries was featured with a photo of Robert and Victoria at some charity gala. Him in a tuxedo, her in a red dress that probably cost more than my monthly motel bill. The caption read, "Power couple Robert Caldwell and attorney Victoria Sterling at the Governor's Business Excellence Awards." Power couple. They'd made it official in the society pages before I'd even moved out. As the plane lifted off, I pressed my face to the window and watched Connecticut disappear below me. Somewhere down there, Max and Bella were probably looking for me, wondering why I'd abandoned them. Robert was probably pouring champagne to celebrate his new life. Victoria was probably redecorating my kitchen. But here's what none of them knew. Grandfather Henry had taught me something about patience. He used to say, "The best revenge is patience, Maggie girl. Plant your seeds quietly, water them consistently, and wait for harvest time." I had no idea what seeds I was planting or when harvest time might come. All I knew was that 63 wasn't dead, broke wasn't permanent, and underestimating Margaret Caldwell had always been a mistake. Robert was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Joyce's guest room had lavender walls and a collection of ceramic dolphins that would have horrified my former interior designer. After 5 days of sleeping on sheets that smelled like fabric softener and listening to my sister's cats purr outside my door, I was starting to feel almost human again. Almost. Joyce worked as a medical billing specialist from home, which meant she was there to witness my daily breakdown routine. Coffee, tears, CNN, more tears, lunch, phone calls to lawyers who couldn't help me, and afternoon naps that lasted until dinner. It wasn't my finest period. "You need to get out of this room," Joyce announced Friday morning, armed with coffee and what looked like a mission. "We're going to handle Grandpa Henry's paperwork today." Grandfather Henry had died 6 months ago, at 94. Sharp as a tack until the end. I'd been so consumed with Robert's betrayal that I'd barely processed the grief. Henry had been my favorite person in the world, a Depression-era kid who'd built a small fortune through careful investing and stubbornness. "What paperwork?" I asked, pulling on the same jeans I'd worn for 3 days straight. "He left some things for you. Bank stuff. I've been meaning to handle it, but with everything going on." Joyce handed me a manila envelope that smelled like his old house: coffee, Old Spice, and furniture polish. Inside were 3 items: Henry's obituary from the Hartford Courant, a key taped to an index card, and a handwritten note in his careful cursework that simply said, "For Maggie, Farmers Savings Bank, account the required 472891. Started this for you when you were born. Love, Grandpa." I stared at the note, trying to remember any conversations about a bank account. "Joyce, did you know about this?" "Know about what?" She looked over my shoulder. "Oh, that old savings account. I think Mom mentioned it once. Grandpa opened accounts for all us grandkids when we were born. Probably has $50 in it by now." $50. Better than nothing, which was exactly what I had. The Farmers Savings Bank was a small brick building, squeezed between a nail salon and a sandwich shop in downtown New Haven. The kind of place that still used paper ledgers and had the same tellers who'd worked there since the Carter administration. "I'd like to check on an account," I told the woman behind the counter, a pleasant lady named Dorothy who wore reading glasses on a chain. "My grandfather opened it in 1960. Dorothy typed the account number into her computer, then frowned. She typed it again. Then she called over her supervisor, a man in his 50s who looked like he'd seen everything in 30 years of banking. "Ma'am," the supervisor said carefully, "could you repeat that account number?" I read it again from Grandpa's note. Both bank employees exchanged glances. "And you said this account was opened in 1960? Dorothy asked. "Yes, my grandfather Henry Caldwell opened it when I was born. He said he put $50 in it." The supervisor cleared his throat. "Mrs. Caldwell, this account has been accumulating compound interest for 65 years. The original deposit was indeed $50, but with interest compounded monthly at various rates over the decades." He turned his computer screen toward me. I looked at the number, looked again, blinked hard, and looked a third time. 847,592.1619. "That's impossible," I whispered. "Compound interest," Dorothy said with a smile. "It's like magic, but legal. $847,000. From $50 my grandfather had deposited the year I was born and then apparently never touched. While I'd been sleeping in motels and begging for scraps from my own divorce, I'd been sitting on a fortune." I started laughing. Not the polite chuckle you give when someone tells a mildly amusing story, but the kind of laughter that comes from the depths of your soul when the universe plays a joke so perfect you have to respect the timing. "Ma'am," the supervisor said nervously, "are you all right?" "I'm perfect," I said, wiping tears from my eyes. "Absolutely perfect. I'd like to access this account immediately." As Dorothy printed out 65 years of statements showing the slow, steady growth of $50 into a small fortune, I thought about Robert's parting words. "Sue me. I own this town." He was about to discover that someone else had just acquired a significant interest in his neighborhood. Someone who understood the power of patience, compound interest, and very, very careful planning. "Grandfather Henry, wherever you are," I thought, "this one's for you." I spent 3 hours at that bank, going through decades of statements with Dorothy and the supervisor, whose name was Frank. Grandfather Henry hadn't just deposited $50 and forgotten about it. He'd been quietly adding small amounts every month for 40 years. $5 here, $10 there, sometimes as much as $25 during good months. "Your grandfather was quite the saver," Frank said, showing me statements from the 1980s. "Look at this. He never missed a monthly deposit until 2000. "What happened in 2000? I asked. "According to our records, he moved to Florida. But by then, the account was substantial enough that compound interest alone was adding significant value annually." I did the math. From 1960 to 2000, Grandpa had deposited roughly $8,000 total. Interest rates in the 60s and 70s were much higher than today, some years reaching 15% APY. That money had been doubling every 5 to 7 years for 6 decades. "Frank," I said carefully, "I need to understand something. This money, it's really mine?" "According to our records, Henry Caldwell named you as the sole beneficiary when he opened the account. Your social security number is on file. You're the only person who can access these funds." I walked out of that bank with a cashier's check for $847,392.16 and a head full of possibilities. Joyce was waiting in the car, scrolling through her phone. "So? Was it $50? She asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. I handed her the check. She looked at it, blinked, looked again, then promptly started crying. "Oh my God, Maggie, oh my God, you're rich." "I'm not rich," I said, though my hands were shaking. "But I'm not broke either." That evening, I sat in Joyce's backyard with a glass of wine, researching Caldwell Industries on my laptop. Robert thought he'd gotten away with the perfect crime, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated my intelligence. Caldwell Industries was privately held, but like many companies, it had taken on investors over the years. According to recent filings, Robert owned 60% of the company directly. The remaining 40% was split between venture capital firms and private investors who'd bought in during the company's expansion phase. Here's what Robert didn't know. Private investors sell their shares all the time, and some of those shares were currently available through a discrete investment firm that specialized in private equity transactions. I spent the next 2 days making phone calls to investment firms, to lawyers, to accountants. I learned about shell corporations, anonymous purchases, and exactly how someone could acquire a significant stake in a private company without the current leadership knowing who was buying. By Wednesday, I had a plan. Thomas Mitchell was a lawyer I'd known for 20 years, a contemporary of Robert's who'd always treated me with respect instead of the condescending patience most of Robert's colleagues showed their wives. When I called him, he agreed to meet me at his office in Hartford. "Margaret," Thomas said, standing as I entered his conference room. "Joyce told me what happened. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry, Thomas. Be helpful. I need to buy a company." His eyebrows rose. "Buy a company?" "Specifically, I need to acquire shares in Caldwell Industries. Anonymously. Is that possible?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Margaret, Robert has majority ownership. Even if you bought every available share, you'd never have control." "I don't want control," I said. "I want a seat at the table. I want voting rights. I want to be in the room when decisions are made about the company I helped build." "How many shares are we talking about?" I opened my laptop and showed him my research. According to this, approximately 35% of the company's shares have traded hands in the last 5 years. If I could acquire even 20%, that would make me the second largest shareholder. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "This would require setting up a trust, possibly multiple shell corporations to maintain anonymity. It's legal, but complex, and expensive." "How expensive?" "Based on the company's last valuation, 20% would cost roughly $600,000. I smiled and reached into my purse for the bank statements. "Thomas, let me tell you about my grandfather's savings account." An hour later, Thomas was drafting papers to establish the Meridian Investment Trust with me as the sole beneficiary and anonymous benefactor. By the end of the week, Meridian would begin purchasing shares in Caldwell Industries through a series of discrete transactions designed to avoid attention. "Margaret," Thomas said as I prepared to leave, "what exactly are you planning to do with these shares?" "Nothing dramatic," I said. "I just want to attend the quarterly board meeting. As a shareholder, I have that right." And then? I thought about Robert's smirk, Victoria's condescension, my dogs who were probably still looking for me at the sliding door. Then I'm going to remind my ex-husband that sometimes the woman you underestimate turns out to be the one holding all the cards. The next 3 weeks were the most educational of my life. I learned about proxy votes, shareholder rights, and the fascinating world of corporate governance. I also learned that when you have money and the right lawyer, things that seem impossible become merely expensive. Thomas worked with a network of investment professionals who specialized in discrete transactions. Through a series of purchases spread across multiple firms and dates, the Meridian Investment Trust quietly acquired 23.7% of Caldwell Industries. Not enough to control the company, but more than enough to make Robert's life very interesting. I moved into a small apartment in West Hartford, close enough to monitor my investment, but far enough from my old life to maintain anonymity. The apartment was nothing special. 2 bedrooms, updated kitchen, a small balcony where I could drink my morning coffee and plan my strategy. Because that's what this was, strategy. Not revenge exactly, but justice. A careful, patient correction of the record. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for October 15th. As a shareholder holding more than 20% of the company, I had the right to attend and the right to address the board on any matters affecting company value. I'd been studying Robert's leadership decisions, and I'd found some very interesting patterns. Caldwell Industries had been hemorrhaging money on Victoria's legal fees, not just for their affair, but for elaborate corporate restructuring that seemed designed to benefit Robert personally while limiting the company's tax obligations. Victoria had been billing the company for strategic consulting at $800 per hour, often for services that seemed suspiciously personal. I'd also discovered that Robert had been using company resources for his new lifestyle with Victoria. The company had purchased a corporate retreat property in the Hamptons that happened to be where they spent their weekends. Company funds had paid for Victoria's wardrobe allowance as professional development. Even their wine collection was being expensed as client entertainment. None of this was illegal. Exactly, but it wasn't great for shareholder value. On October 14th, I got my hair done. Nothing dramatic, just a trim and style that made me look professional rather than like a woman who'd been living in her sister's guest room for a month. I bought a navy blue suit, modest jewelry, and comfortable heels. I wanted to look like money, but old money, established money, the kind of investor who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. That evening, I called Thomas for a final briefing. "Remember," he said, "you don't need to reveal your identity immediately. As the representative of Meridian Investment Trust, you have every right to be there. Let them wonder who you are and what you want. And if Robert recognizes me, he might. But even if he does, he can't remove you from the meeting. You're there as a shareholder, and you own nearly a quarter of his company." I hung up and stood on my balcony, looking out at the Hartford skyline. Somewhere out there, Robert was probably having dinner with Victoria, celebrating another successful day of spending company money on their personal life. They had no idea that tomorrow would be different. I thought about Max and Bella, wondering if they still looked for me at the door. I thought about the house where I'd planted roses that would bloom again next spring for someone else to enjoy. I thought about 38 years of marriage reduced to a $1,500 monthly check and a seat at a motel breakfast bar. But mostly, I thought about Grandfather Henry and his $50 investment in my future. He'd taught me that patience wasn't passive, it was strategic. You wait for the right moment, then you act with precision. Tomorrow was going to be the right moment. The Caldwell Industries board meeting was held in the top-floor conference room of a downtown Hartford office building. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Connecticut River, and the mahogany table could seat 20 people comfortably. I arrived at 9:45 a.m. for the 10 a.m. meeting, dressed in my navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio that Thomas had suggested would make me look appropriately corporate. The receptionist, a young woman named Ashley, checked her list twice when I introduced myself as the representative from Meridian Investment Trust. "I don't have you on the list," she said nervously. "Call Thomas Mitchell's office," I said calmly. "He submitted my credentials yesterday." While Ashley made phone calls, I stood by the windows and watched the morning traffic below. I felt remarkably calm for someone about to detonate a bomb in her ex-husband's perfectly orchestrated new life. "Ms. Ashley paused, realizing she didn't have my name. "Smith," I said. "Margaret Smith. Ms. Smith, Mr. Mitchell's office confirmed your registration. Conference room A is just down the hall." I walked into that conference room like I belonged there, which legally I did. The board consisted of 7 people, Robert at the head of the table, Victoria to his right as corporate counsel, and 5 other board members I recognized from various business functions over the years. Robert was reviewing papers and didn't look up when I entered. Victoria glanced at me with the polite disinterest she reserved for people who weren't worth her attention. "Good morning," I said, taking a seat near the middle of the table. "Margaret Smith, representing Meridian Investment Trust." That's when Robert looked up. His face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, recognition, shock, and finally, a carefully controlled anger. "Margaret," he said slowly, "what are you doing here?" "Representing my client's interests," I replied smoothly. "Meridian Investment Trust holds a significant stake in this company." Victoria leaned forward. "I'm sorry. What company are you referring to?" I smiled at her, with the same fake politeness she'd used when denying me access to my dogs. Caldwell Industries, of course. Meridian Trust purchased 23.7% of outstanding shares over the past month. The silence in that room was beautiful. Robert's face had gone pale. Victoria was frantically typing on her phone, and the other board members were looking between us like spectators at a tennis match. "That's impossible," Robert said finally. "I would have been notified of any major purchases. Only if the purchases exceeded the notification threshold in a single transaction," I said, consulting my notes. "Multiple smaller purchases through different firms don't require disclosure until the quarterly reporting period, which is today." Victoria's voice was tight. "Who exactly is Meridian Investment Trust?" I looked directly at her, remembering her red dress in my house, her hands on my husband, her voice saying the dogs were corporate assets. "I am," I said simply. Robert stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward. "This is unacceptable. You can't just buy your way into my company." "Our company," I corrected. "And actually, I can. Corporate law is quite clear on shareholder rights, as I'm sure your counsel can confirm." All eyes turned to Victoria, who looked like she was frantically trying to remember everything she'd ever learned about securities law. We need to verify the legitimacy of these purchases." "Of course," I said, sliding a folder across the table. "Thomas Mitchell prepared all the documentation. Everything is perfectly legal and properly filed." For the next 2 hours, I sat quietly while they scrambled to understand how Margaret Caldwell, the woman they'd dismissed as a powerless ex-wife, had become the second largest shareholder in Robert's company. I listened to them discuss damage control, legal challenges, and whether my purchases could be reversed. They couldn't be. Thomas had done his homework too well. Finally, Robert turned to me with the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd been playing chess while his opponent was playing three-dimensional space war. "What do you want, Margaret?" I smiled and opened my portfolio to the first item on my agenda. "Well, Robert, since you asked, I'd like to discuss the company's recent expenditures on legal fees, corporate retreats, and professional development. As a shareholder, I'm concerned about the efficient use of corporate resources." Victoria's face went white. She knew exactly which expenditures I meant. "But first," I continued, "I think we should address the company's pet policy. I understand Caldwell Industries recently acquired some corporate assets that might be better classified as personal property." Robert's jaw tightened. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious. In fact, I think Max and Bella would be much happier in a more appropriate environment. Don't you?" That's when I knew I had won. Not just the battle, but the war. Because Robert was finally beginning to understand what it felt like to be completely, utterly powerless while someone else held all the cards. And we were just getting started. The first thing Robert did was call an emergency executive session, which meant asking me to leave the room while the real board members discussed strategy. The second thing he did was make the biggest mistake of his corporate career. "Margaret," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Why don't we step outside and discuss this privately?" I looked around the table at the 5 other board members, all of whom were watching this family drama unfold with the fascination of people witnessing a spectacular car accident. "Actually, Robert, I'd prefer to keep our discussions transparent. After all, this is a business matter now, not a personal one." His face flushed red. "Fine. Board members only. I am a board member," I said calmly. "With 23.7% ownership, I have automatic voting rights and meeting participation privileges." Victoria cleared her throat. "Robert, she's technically correct." The look he gave her could have melted steel. This was their first crack, the moment when Victoria realized that sleeping with the CEO didn't make her immune to corporate law. For the next hour, I listened to them plot damage control. Robert wanted to challenge the legitimacy of my purchases. Victoria suggested restructuring the company to dilute my shares. One board member, David Chen, who'd always been decent to me at company parties, quietly pointed out that any restructuring would require shareholder approval, which means Margaret would have to approve her own dilution, he said with barely concealed amusement. When they re-adjourned the full meeting, Robert tried a different approach. Margaret, let's be reasonable. What will it take for you to sell your shares back to the company? I'm not interested in selling, I replied. I'm interested in participating. I helped build this company, and now I intend to help run it. That afternoon, Victoria showed up at my apartment. I was expecting her. Desperate people always try the personal approach when the legal one fails. May I come in? She asked, all traces of her earlier arrogance replaced by careful politeness. Of course. Coffee? We sat in my small living room, two women who'd been circling each other for months, finally face to face without Robert as a buffer. This isn't going to bring him back, Victoria said without preamble. I laughed. Honey, I don't want him back. I want justice. What does justice look like to you? It looks like transparency, like honest accounting, like a company that serves its shareholders instead of funding personal vendettas and expensive divorces. Victoria set down her coffee cup. I love him, you know. I loved him too, for 38 years. But love doesn't excuse theft, and it doesn't excuse humiliation. Robert says you're trying to ruin him. Robert ruined himself the moment he decided I was expendable. I'm just providing consequences. After Victoria left, I called Thomas. They're going to fight dirty, I told him. Probably. But we have the law on our side, and more importantly, we have the money. As long as you can maintain your stake, you control nearly a quarter of that company. That evening, I drove to my old house. I didn't plan to go inside. I just wanted to see Max and Bella. I parked across the street and waited. At 6 o'clock, Robert came home. At 6:15, I saw familiar golden shapes in the backyard. I got out of my car and whistled softly. Both dogs' heads snapped up. Max started barking immediately, that excited bark that meant family's home. Bella ran to the fence, whimpering and trying to push her nose through the slats. The back door slammed open, and Robert appeared. Get the hell away from my property. I'm on a public street, I called back. And those are my dogs. The divorce agreement says otherwise. The shareholder agreement says I have a lot of new rights. We should probably discuss that soon. I got back in my car and drove away, but not before I saw the look on Robert's face. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, he looked scared. Good. It was about time. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in corporate warfare. Robert hired additional lawyers to find loopholes in my stock purchases. Victoria billed the company $127,000 in legal fees for shareholder dispute resolution. They even tried to call a special board meeting to vote me out, until David Chen reminded them that removing a shareholder required cause, and being the ex-wife wasn't legally sufficient. Meanwhile, I was learning exactly how deep Robert's financial misconduct went. As a major shareholder, I had the right to examine company books. What I found made my divorce settlement look like pocket change. Over the past 2 years, Robert had used company funds to purchase a $2.3 million corporate property in Martha's Vineyard that he and Victoria used exclusively. He'd bought her a BMW under executive vehicle allowance. He'd even expensed their couples therapy as executive counseling services. But the really interesting discovery was Victoria's billing pattern. She'd been charging the company for legal work that had nothing to do with Caldwell Industries. Immigration cases, personal injury suits, even divorce proceedings for other clients, all billed to Robert's company at premium corporate rates. This is fraud, Thomas said when I showed him the records. They've been using company resources to subsidize Victoria's entire practice. How much are we talking about? Over the past 18 months, roughly $800,000 in questionable expenses. I stared at the numbers, feeling that familiar cold rage settle in my chest. While I'd been sleeping in a motel and begging for access to my own dogs, they'd been stealing nearly $1 million from the company I'd helped build. Thomas, I want to call another board meeting. What's your agenda? Corporate accountability, financial transparency, and a motion to replace Robert as CEO. Margaret, even with your shares, you can't force that vote alone. I don't have to force it. I just have to present the evidence and let the other board members decide if they want to be accessories to embezzlement. The November board meeting was very different from October's. This time, I arrived with 3 boxes of documentation, a forensic accountant, and a detailed presentation about fiscal responsibility and shareholder value. Robert and Victoria sat at one end of the table like defendants at their own trial. The other board members looked increasingly uncomfortable as I walked them through 2 years of questionable expenditures. "This Martha's Vineyard property," I said, clicking through photos on my laptop, "was purchased with company funds but used exclusively for personal vacations. The vehicle allowance for Ms. Sterling exceeds the CEO's own transportation budget. And these legal fees." I let the silence stretch while they absorbed the numbers. "Are you suggesting criminal activity?" asked Maria Santos, the board's financial oversight member. "I'm suggesting a pattern of using corporate resources for personal benefit without proper board approval or shareholder notification." Victoria finally spoke up. "These expenses were all properly categorized." "By whom?" I interrupted. "By the attorney who was billing for services she never provided?" Robert slammed his hand on the table. "This is harassment. You're using your position to wage a personal vendetta." "I'm using my position to protect my investment. Something you should have been doing all along." David Chen leaned forward. "Margaret, what exactly are you proposing?" "Full financial audit. Immediate reimbursement of personal expenses charged to the company. And new leadership oversight to ensure this doesn't happen again." "You want me removed as CEO?" Robert said flatly. "I want you accountable as CEO. Whether you can remain in that role depends on your willingness to accept proper oversight." The vote wasn't even close. 5-2 in favor of the financial audit, with only Robert and Victoria dissenting. 4-3 in favor of establishing a financial oversight committee with full authority to review and approve executive expenses. I was elected chair of that committee by unanimous vote, -2 abstentions. As the meeting ended, Robert cornered me in the hallway. "This isn't over, Margaret." "You're right," I said. "It's not, because next month I'm calling for a vote on CEO compensation packages. Did you know your salary has increased 340% in the past 5 years, while company profits have stayed flat?" His face went white. "You can't do this. Watch me." That evening, I had dinner at a small restaurant near my apartment. As I was leaving, I got a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. A friend." The email contained a single attachment, a private investigator's report on Victoria Sterling's law practice. Apparently, someone else had been watching my ex-husband's girlfriend, and they'd discovered something very interesting. Victoria Sterling was being investigated by the State Bar Association for billing irregularities. Multiple clients had complained about being charged for work that was never performed. Her law license was under review. I smiled and forwarded the email to Thomas. Robert thought he'd won the game by choosing a smart, ambitious attorney as his partner. He'd actually chosen a criminal. The State Bar investigation became public the following Monday. The Hartford Courant ran a front-page article, "Prominent attorney under investigation for billing fraud." By Tuesday, 3 more clients had come forward with complaints against Victoria Sterling. Robert's first instinct was to circle the wagons. "It's a misunderstanding," he told the board in an emergency conference call. "Victoria's practice is completely separate from Caldwell Industries. Except for the $800,000 in questionable legal fees she's charged our company," I replied. "That makes it very much our business." The board voted to suspend all payments to Victoria's firm pending the outcome of the investigation. They also voted to hire an independent attorney to review all of her previous work for the company. Robert was furious, but helpless. My 23.7% stake, combined with the growing concerns of other board members, meant I could block any decision I didn't approve of. But Robert wasn't going down without a fight. Thursday morning, I woke up to find a private investigator sitting in a car outside my apartment building. By afternoon, there were 2. Robert was having me followed, probably looking for anything he could use to discredit me or challenge my stock purchases. He wouldn't find anything, because there wasn't anything to find. But the intimidation attempt told me he was getting desperate. Friday afternoon, Victoria showed up at my apartment again. This time, she looked different, haggard, stressed, her usually perfect appearance showing cracks. "I need to talk to you," she said. "About what?" "About Robert, about the company, about things you don't know." I let her in, curious, despite myself. "The bar investigation isn't going away," she said without preamble. "They're going to find irregularities because there are irregularities. Robert knew about them." That was interesting. "What kind of irregularities?" "I've been using company funds to pay personal debts, credit cards, my mortgage, even my daughter's college tuition. Robert approved all of it." "Why are you telling me this?" Victoria's composure finally cracked. "Because he's throwing me under the bus. His new attorney is claiming I acted independently, that he had no knowledge of the billing discrepancies. He's going to let me lose my license to save himself." I studied her face, looking for signs of deception. She looked genuinely terrified. "What do you want from me, Victoria?" "Help. Testimony that Robert was involved in the financial decisions. In exchange, I'll tell you everything about how he's been manipulating company finances." "Why should I trust you?" "Because," she said, tears starting to flow, "I'm about to lose everything, and you're the only person with both the knowledge and the power to make this right." 2 hours later, Victoria had given me enough evidence to bury Robert's career permanently. Offshore accounts, kickback schemes with contractors, even a complex insurance fraud involving the Martha's Vineyard property. "He's been planning to sell the company," she told me. "There's a buyer lined up, a private equity firm. Robert was going to take the money and disappear, leave all the legal problems behind." "When?" "January. The sale was supposed to go through after the holidays." I called Thomas immediately. "Emergency board meeting, tomorrow. What's the agenda?" "CEO removal for cause, and I need you to freeze all executive compensation pending the investigation." That evening, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine and thought about justice. It's a funny thing. You spend your whole life believing that good behavior gets rewarded and bad behavior gets punished. But then life teaches you that sometimes bad behavior just gets more creative. But sometimes, if you're patient and smart and very, very careful, justice finds a way. Robert had made one mistake after another, underestimating me, trusting Victoria completely, and believing that money and power made him untouchable. Tomorrow, he was going to learn how wrong he'd been. The December board meeting was standing room only. Word had leaked about Victoria's cooperation with the investigation, and Robert arrived with his own attorney, a sharp-dressed woman from Hartford who specialized in executive protection cases. I arrived with Thomas, Victoria, and a box of evidence that would have made the FBI proud. "Before we begin," Robert's attorney announced, "I want to state for the record that my client denies all allegations and reserves the right to pursue legal action against anyone making false claims." "Noted," I said calmly. "Now, let's discuss the evidence." For the next 3 hours, I walked the board through Robert's financial crimes in excruciating detail. The offshore accounts Victoria had helped him establish. The contractor kickbacks that had inflated project costs by 25%. The insurance claim for storm damage at Martha's Vineyard that had been caused by a party, not weather. But the real bombshell was the planned sale of the company. Robert has been negotiating with Pinnacle Investment Group to sell Caldwell Industries for $14 million, I announced. He planned to complete the sale without notifying shareholders or board members, taking a $8.4 million payout for his 60% stake. The room erupted. David Chen demanded to see the documentation. Maria Santos asked why the board hadn't been informed. Even Robert's attorney looked shocked. "That's completely legal," Robert said, but his voice was shaking. "I have majority ownership." "You have majority ownership," I agreed. "But you also have fiduciary responsibility to all shareholders. Selling the company without disclosure, especially while under investigation for financial misconduct, could be considered fraud." Thomas stood up. "I'd like to call for a vote of no confidence in Robert Caldwell as CEO." "Seconded," said David Chen immediately. The vote was 6-1. Only Robert voted to keep himself as CEO. "I'd also like to nominate Margaret Smith as interim CEO while we search for permanent leadership," Thomas continued. That vote was 5-2, with Robert and one other member dissenting. Just like that, I went from divorced housewife to CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. As we were adjourning, Victoria stood up. "There's something else you all need to know. About the planned sale." Robert's face went white. "Victoria, don't. Pinnacle Investment Group isn't who they claim to be," she continued. "They're a shell company. Robert wasn't selling to outside investors. He was selling to himself. The plan was to buy the company back at a massive discount after it was stripped of assets, then rebuild it without any of the original shareholders. The silence in that room was deafening. That's securities fraud, Maria Santos whispered. That's embezzlement, David Chen corrected. And conspiracy? Robert stood up so quickly his chair fell over. This meeting is over. Actually, I said, consulting my notes, as interim CEO, I'm calling for an immediate forensic audit of all company accounts, a freeze on all executive assets, and a report to the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding potential fraud. Robert stared at me with an expression of pure hatred. You've destroyed everything, Margaret. 38 years of building this company, and you've destroyed it for revenge. I've saved it, I corrected. From you. As Robert stormed out, followed by his attorney and a trail of legal threats, Victoria approached me. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet, I replied. You're still facing disbarment and possibly criminal charges. I know, but at least now the truth is out. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, now the interim CEO of a company worth $14 million, holding evidence that could send my ex-husband to prison. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Heard about the board meeting. Proud of you. Max and Bella's dog walker. I smiled. Someone was looking out for my dogs, and someone else was making sure I knew they were okay. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Running a company, dealing with investigations, probably more legal threats from Robert. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like Margaret Caldwell again. Not the discarded wife, not the homeless woman in a motel, but the woman who'd helped build something valuable and was now in a position to protect it. Justice, it turned out, was even sweeter than revenge. 6 months later, I was sitting in the CEO's office of Caldwell Industries, reviewing quarterly reports that showed a 23% increase in profitability since Robert's departure. Turns out, when you stop using company funds to subsidize executive vacations and fake legal fees, the bottom line improves dramatically. The SEC investigation had concluded with Robert paying $2.3 million in fines and agreeing to a lifetime ban from serving as a corporate officer. Victoria had lost her law license, but avoided criminal charges in exchange for full cooperation with prosecutors. The Martha's Vineyard property had been sold, with proceeds returned to company coffers. But the best part of my day happened at 5:30 p.m., when my assistant knocked on my office door. Your visitors are here, Ms. Caldwell. Max and Bella burst through the door like furry torpedoes, nearly knocking me over with enthusiastic greetings. Behind them walked David Chen, who'd become the company's board chairman and had personally driven to my old house to retrieve my dogs when Robert moved out. How are my best executives? I asked, rubbing behind Max's ears while Bella tried to climb into my lap. They missed you, David said. The whole neighborhood knew they weren't where they belonged. Getting my dogs back had required one final legal maneuver. As interim CEO, I'd instituted a company policy prohibiting personal use of corporate assets, including pets that had been wrongly classified as business property. Robert's new attorney had tried to fight it, but after months of legal bills and mounting evidence of his financial crimes, Robert had finally given up. These days, Max and Bella came to work with me every day. They had their own beds in my office and had become beloved company mascots. Employees stopped by to give them treats, and they'd made the company holiday card. My phone rang. Thomas calling with updates on the final settlement negotiations. Roberts agreed to the terms, he said. Full restitution of questionable expenses, transfer of the remaining shares to establish an employee stock ownership program, and a formal apology to be published in the Hartford Courant. And the house? Yours, if you want it. Victoria moved out last month. I looked around my office, then down at Max and Bella, who were now napping on their beds after the excitement of their reunion. I think I'll pass on the house, I said. Too many memories, but I know someone who might be interested in buying it. That evening, I hosted a dinner party in my apartment for the key people who'd helped me reclaim my life. Thomas and his wife, David Chen and his partner, my sister Joyce, who'd flown up from Florida for the occasion. So what's next for the new CEO? Joyce asked over dessert. Actually, I said, raising my wine glass, I have an announcement. I'm stepping down as CEO next month. Everyone started talking at once. David looked particularly concerned. Don't panic, I laughed. I'm not leaving the company. I'm becoming chairman of the board and hiring a proper CEO. Someone younger, with fresh ideas and hopefully better technology skills than a 63-year-old woman who just learned how to use Excel. What will you do with your time? Thomas asked. I scratched Max behind the ears and smiled. I'm thinking about getting married again. The room went quiet. His name is Frank, I continued. He's the bank supervisor who helped me discover Grandpa Henry's account. Turns out, he's been divorced for 3 years, has 2 grandchildren, and makes the best coffee I've ever tasted. Joyce started crying. Happy tears this time. Oh, Maggie, you deserve this. As my friends celebrated around me, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. 18 months ago, I'd been sleeping in a motel, crying over the loss of everything I'd thought was permanent. Tonight, I was surrounded by people who valued me, running a company I'd helped build, and planning a future with someone who saw me as an equal partner, not a convenient accessory. Robert had tried to erase me, to reduce 38 years of marriage to a footnote in his success story. Instead, he'd given me the greatest gift possible, the chance to discover who Margaret Caldwell really was when she wasn't defined by someone else's expectations. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank. Dinner tomorrow? I found a new recipe for apple pie that might change your life. I texted back. My life's already changed, but I'd love to try the pie. Max looked up at me with those golden retriever eyes that seemed to understand everything. Yes, I told him. We're all going to be just fine. Sometimes you have to lose everything to realize you never needed it in the first place. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. And sometimes, if you're very patient and very brave, the universe gives you exactly what you deserve, even if it takes 63 years and a grandfather's $50 investment to get there.